You're listening to the Kingdom Project Podcast. These are discussions on biblical theology and interpretation. The emphasis is on context and grace. The goal is to promote biblical literacy by displacing and debunking most modern interpretations. The challenge is to engage in healthy conversation that may stretch but sharpen iron. This is the Kingdom Project, and I'm your host, Marcus Hall.
After our break last week, we're getting back into Hebrews today. We're in starting chapter 7. And we will finally be looking at this Melchizedek character, so that the author has mentioned many times and then stopped and then going, and we'll see, and we'll have to deal with this guy and the different, there's two views, I guess, two different views, if you will. But it was nice to take the break last week, and then before we jumped into this, we may take one some other point if my brain gets tired again. So, all right, so the author today we're going to look at verses 1 through 10 of Hebrews 7, okay? And this is the priesthood of Melchizedek, all right? So the author's been working their way to this topic for some time. Here we are, we're going to get into it. This is devoted to demonstrating the role of Christ as a priest after the order of Melchizedek, okay? Now, in chapter 2, verse 17, the author announced that Jesus is a merciful and faithful high priest. In chapter 3:1, he calls us to consider our high priest. And in chapter 4, we're encouraged to come to our high priest in time of need to receive mercy and grace. And then in chapter 5, 1 through 10, we're shown how Jesus meets all the qualifications of a priest, right? And he is called a priest of a different order. We'll talk about order here in a moment. And it's not after Aaron, which was in the Levitical priesthood order, okay? So he is not after Aaron, but he is after Melchizedek, all right? So we'll just read 1 through 10. And it says, "For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him. And to him Abraham apportioned a 10th part of everything. He is first, by translation of his name, king of righteousness, and then he is also king of Salem, that is, king of peace. He is without father or mother or genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but resembling the Son of God, he continues a priest forever. See how great this man was, to whom Abraham, the patriarch, gave a 10th of the spoils. And those descendants of Levi who received the priestly office have a commandment in the law to take tithes from the people, that is, from their brothers, though these also are descended from Abraham. But this man, who does not have his descent from them, received tithes from Abraham, and blessed him who had the promises. It is beyond dispute that the inferior is blessed by the superior. In the one case, tithes are received by mortal men, but in the other case, by one of whom it is testified that he lives. One might even say that Levi himself, who receives tithes, paid tithes through Abraham, for he was still in the loins of his ancestor when Melchizedek met him." All right. It's a lot there. But here we are introduced to Melchizedek. We learn about an event that's recorded in Genesis 14, so we're going to go look at that too. That way we can just get a good grounding, all right? And it's after this event, Melchizedek fades into obscurity, okay? That's all we will ever hear about him, except for a psalm that David writes about 1,000 years later or so, okay? So if we want to look at Genesis 14, it's there is more than this, but we'll just look at 14 through 20, just to see if we can understand what the author of Hebrews was saying. And it says, when Abram heard that his kinsmen had been taken captive, he led forth his trained men born in his house, 318 of them, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. And he divided his forces against them by night, he and his servants, and defeated them and pursued them to Hobah, north of Damascus. Then he brought back all the possessions, and he also brought back his kinsman Lot with his possessions, and the women and the people. After his return from the defeat of Kedorlaomer, and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom, went out to meet him at the valley of well, I could say the big word, but not that one. Shaveh, that is the king's valley. And here we go. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High. And he blessed him, and he said, Blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. All right. So in verse 18, Abraham is met by a man who is a king, and he's referred to as Melchizedek. Now, Melchizedek is not his name, all right? It's not his name. The word is a title, much like Pharaoh, much like Caesar, okay? So they're titles, there's not names. And his title means, my king is righteous. The man is also a priest, which means he was an intercessor for the people before God. And both Abraham and now the writer, the author of Hebrews, testified that this man was a true priest of the God Most High. He wasn't a priest to some pagan religion, nor was he just the self-appointed priest, someone faking it. He was actually a man that was appointed as a priest by God himself, okay? Furthermore, Abraham recognized that this man was a person of authority and worthy of his honor because Abraham pays a tithe to him, right? So we know the tithe wasn't for him, for Melchizedek's benefit. Abraham wasn't giving him the spoils because he wanted to honor Melchizedek, because when someone tithes, they do so to honor God. Okay, so if Abraham handed his tithe to Melchizedek, it means that Abraham believed that this man was an intercessor before God. All right, so then finally the author notes that this person appears out of nowhere in the narrative, right, of Genesis. It's very uncharacteristic of Genesis because Moses never spends time addressing his genealogy, right? There's no mention of his parents or his birth. There's no mention of his death. It's very unusual considering how careful and how meticulous not just Moses, but the Jews were, and always to record the beginning and the end of every significant person in the story of Israel. All right? Unless he wasn't from Israel. We have these genealogies of Genesis that are the key feature connecting events from the garden all the way to Christ, all right, who comes to correct the mistake of Adam. And yet, here's this very important person, this character, this individual here, who is never linked to any genealogy. So you have to ask, was this a literal or a figurative way of speaking, right? Was the man actually, or was the author actually saying Melchizedek actually had no mother, no father, no end, no beginning, no end? Or was he saying he doesn't have these things because there's no record of it, right? That's what you have to place in there. So this mystery then, the mystery of Melchizedek leaves us asking, who is it, right? And that's everybody wonders. All right, so this man served as a priest before there was the law of Moses. There was no tabernacle, no sacrificial system. The priest of Aaron had not yet been established. Aaron had not even been born at this time. So how did this priest come to be a priest? Who was he? Where did that priesthood originate? Why did Abraham view him to be his superior before God? And how is this ancient priest related to Jesus, who is our high priest, right? All right, so there's two views here. And so before we consider who Melchizedek was, we'll deal with the one possibility. Many have noticed that the unique characteristics create they'll say it's clear and it's obvious, that a picture of Jesus. The Melchizedek was Jesus, all right? Christ is the King of righteousness. He is the King of peace. He is both a priest and a king, something that priests under the law could never do. And though Christ was born a man, we know he had no beginning, since he existed from the beginning, right? The beginning with the Father. And he has no end, because he lives with the Father forever. He's Alpha and Omega. So clearly, Melchizedek is a picture of Christ, and the author of Hebrews is in the process of making this point. But so some, including myself in the past, has thought or speculated Melchizedek was more than just a picture of Christ, but he was actually a pre-incarnate theophany of Christ. Okay? Was there anybody here that's heard this and thought that before, that Melchizedek was pre-incarnate Christ? No? Okay. It's one or the other. And then really, after we go through what I'm going to give you, you still aren't going to know for sure. I would say we can rule out. We're going to rule out. What I mean is pre-incarnate Christ or an actual man. Once we get through what I'm going to say, that he was an actual man, there's still a bunch of loose ends there. We can only know so much with what we have, okay? So theophany, okay? What is theophany? I said that, right? Theophany is a visible manifestation to mankind of God, okay? So, in other words, some believe that Melchizedek was not a man at all. He was Jesus appearing to Abraham in the form of a man, which happens through the Old Testament. And the Lord appeared to Abraham at his tent in Genesis 18. Okay? But this interpretation, you could say, makes a common mistake in confusing a picture for the substance. All right? And it's kind of ironic, because this confusion only serves to prove what the author of Hebrews was concerned about in the first place. That concerning Melchizedek, there's much to say and it's hard to explain, right? You may not understand it, because even today, many of us continue to miss that point. And it's maybe not that we're missing the point, but we just want to say you can't rule this out. Cannot rule it out that it was Jesus. But I think you can, because I have. So, as you will see. And is it an error? No, I don't think it is there, but I'll let you know. So, what's going on here? Okay, so Melchizedek was a real man who served as a priest of God in Abraham's day. So before we understand that, let's just rule out the theory then that he was a pre-incarnate Christ, okay? First, we have the author's description of Melchizedek, okay? It precludes as interpretation that this man was a theophany, because the author says this man was like the Son of God, okay? The term like means to be made in the likeness of something, right? Now, if we're created or made in the image of God, we're not God, right? It's like that. So the man, Melchizedek, was made in the likeness of the Son of God. So this is the exact opposite situation of an actual theophany. A theophany is always the Son of God, pre-incarnate Jesus, being made in the likeness of something else, okay? Like a burning bush or a man visiting Abraham. So Melchizedek isn't this theophany. He's a type. He's a shadow, a picture pointing to Christ, of Christ pointing to Christ. Okay. Furthermore, the author says in verse 8 that that mortal man received tithes. So we know Abraham gave him a tithe, he received it, and the author calls, you could say then that the author is referring to Melchizedek as a mortal man. Then if he was, then certainly he had a beginning and he had an end. Mortal means he was an ordinary human being and not a theophany, all right? And then we learn in previous to this chapter, in 5:1, that a priest is always taken from among men to represent those in whose likeness he shares. All right, so the author had explained that since men must be represented by a man, man, Christ took the form of man so that he could become our high priest. So the author says that Melchizedek was a priest to the Most High God, and as a priest, he represented men before God. So he could have only done that if he was truly a man. So if there was this theophany, a pre-incarnate version of Christ, then it came prior to Christ's incarnation, right? If it predates his carnation, then Christ was not yet a man yet, right? He had to be born to be a man. He was 100% God, 100% man. He was not yet fully a man in that sense, and therefore unable to serve as a priest before man. So I would say this man's real. He's an historical figure. He was king over the Jebusite city of Salem. He served as a priest of God to men on earth in that day, and such so that even Abraham sought for him when he desired to worship and tithe to God. Okay? So then that brings us back to the question, who is he? Who was he then, right? So the first thing to remember from a few lessons ago is this term order, all right? The order of Melchizedek. It doesn't mean organization or some sort of secret club or anything like that. It means succession. It refers to a handing down of an office from person to person through succession of office holders, right? For example, the office of high priest and the Aaronic order was held for life, okay? Then handed down to a successor upon the death of the current office holder. That succession started with Aaron, so we call it the Aaronic order. But there was only one high priest at a time, okay? So in the same way, the order of Melchizedek describes a succession of priests. Each person in this order held the office for life. And the next office holder received the office upon the death of the prior office holder. So each man who held office inherited the title Melchizedek, right? Just like Caesar, like Pharaoh. But this wasn't his actual name. So the name of this man is obscured by Moses, who only recorded his title. But we can find a clue in 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 5. Peter declares that Noah, I'm not saying Noah was Melchizedek, but Noah was the preacher of righteousness in his day. It said, when he's talking about the destruction of the world by the flood, that God did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a preacher of righteousness. All right? Now, some of the English translations aren't that helpful. It can obscure the real Greek. Literal, though, and Young's literal translation reads this way. The old world did not spare, but the eighth person, Noah, of righteousness, a preacher. All right, so a more literal translation reveals that Peter was saying Noah was this eighth person of righteousness. Okay, now, even though he was there were 8 people in the ark, he's not pointing to that, though, okay? He's calling Noah an eighth person of righteousness, as in the eighth man in an order of people referred to as righteous. So from Peter, we learn that Noah was this eighth person to hold this office of Melchizedek. And if Noah was the eighth, then it's relatively simple to follow the succession backward to learn that who the previous seven men were to hold that position. So what we're learning here then is that ever since the fall of Adam, that God has appointed one man to serve as his priest on earth. So it was from Adam to Seth to Enosh to Kenan, Malaleel to Jared, Methuselah to Noah. So that man was always found in the line of the seed promise. Each man held the office until he died. And the office of Melchizedek was inherited by the next man in the seed promise line. And this priesthood then predates the priesthood of the law, as I said. But it continued on even after the law was put in place. And it says it's a superior priesthood, one that by its very name foretells its purpose to bring in righteousness. Now we'll come back to the relationship between the priesthood of the law and the priesthood of Melchizedek later, probably next week. For now, all we need to understand is that this priesthood is the one that Jesus belongs to. All right? So who was the priest that met Abraham, right? Well, Noah was a Melchizedek, but he had died shortly before Abraham's battle with the kings. So some are going to say it was Noah's son, Shem, who was the next man in the line of the seed promise. And Shem inherited the office of righteousness and became the Melchizedek then that Abraham had met. And if you look at history, Shem, he outlived Abraham, so Abraham never inherited this title, right, himself. It was passed from Shem to Jacob, and Shem had settled in the area of Canaan, and apparently he also became the king then of the city of Salem, making him not only a priest of righteousness, but also a king as well. So he's both. So in that way, his life became a type or a shadow of Jesus as well, who was both priest and king, right? And we know Abraham was a descendant of Shem, and Shem was Abraham's great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather. So in this culture of patriarchs, right, a patriarchal culture, Abraham naturally viewed Shem as his superior. That's why the author says that this man, Melchizedek, was Abraham's superior. Okay? Even more interesting is that the king that Abraham had killed, was that Kedorlaomer, was also a descendant of Shem. So Abraham had killed a distant cousin, which was another member of Shem's family. So Shem met Abraham, presumably to restore peace in the family through an offering of this bread and wine that it mentioned. And while Abraham tithed to him in recognition of his authority over the family and in thanks for the victory, that it's even in this gesture we find another picture of Jesus in that he reconciles us to our Father, which is interesting too. This is going to be short. I didn't want to bog you guys down with a ton, because it's so much. And there's more teaching. I mean, I always teach, but it just seemed very teachy today. All right, so you have that. Now, whether it was Shem, I just want to make clear, whether it was Shem or not, I'm not 100% sure on this, all right? Okay, so you guys have to know that. But like you said, you have pre-incarnate Christ, which I think I've made a case to rule out, and many other I've looked at so many things. Many others have ruled that out as well. And then it comes down to him being an actual man. And like I said, he uses these references, no father, no mother, no genealogy, because there was just no record of it. But it shows the shadow or the type that he would be like Christ of those things that resemble him. Okay, so there's many more, I think, people who believe that this Melchizedek character was a real man, a real historical figure and priest. But exactly who it was, that's where the argument is. All right. So in verses 8 and 10, the author says that this analysis, it proves that the priesthood of Melchizedek was a greater priesthood than the one that follows the law. The priests of the law were descended from Levi, who himself was descended from Abraham. So just as Abraham showed Shem, if that's who it was, respect because he was his elder, then just the logical extension here is that Levi would have done the same thing had he been alive. And likewise with Aaron, who was descended from Levi, would have not acknowledged Melchizedek as his superior had Aaron been alive to meet him as Abraham did. Therefore, the author says that Levi and Aaron were present in Abraham's loins, meaning that this priest was superior to any order that came later. All right? So the Levitical priesthood is inferior to this. Melchizedek, the Melchizedek priesthood must always be considered superior to the one given in the law. So this priesthood of Melchizedek is so important because it demonstrates that the Lord has been at work since the very beginning, obviously, right? Providing an intercessor for sinful men always. Long before Moses and the law, God had made a provision for a priesthood, one that's called the Lord is righteous, that stood for generations, moving from man to man. And in each generation there stood a man, and only one man, who could intercede on behalf of those who wanted God's mercy. And that man served until death. One day this priesthood was inherited then by Jesus, which would make sense that Jesus' earthly father Joseph is not around much in the Gospels at all. Most of the speculation is that he had died, right? It would make sense then that he died because Jesus received the office of Melchizedek from him then. And that would explain why he died by the time Jesus' earthly ministry began. Jesus had to inherit the order of Melchizedek during his earthly life. And that's why you see the genealogy in Matthew's gospel passing through Joseph. He was passing the seed line and the order of Melchizedek to Jesus. And since Jesus became a man to serve as our intercessor, that had to fit in. So, for the first and the last time, the order was held by one who was truly righteous then, without sin and perfect. This was Jesus. And since Jesus lives forever, the order will never be passed down to anyone else. He is Melchizedek from now on. The order will be held forever by Jesus, who is a priest in the order of Melchizedek, having rightly obtained it through his inheritance. And that's then next time we'll see how the author explaining that point to its fullest.